Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas not a week ago that Marguerite and I, visiting her brother's home, might chanced, while sitting in their back parlour, to talk with Oliver, my young nephew of 8. He surprised me by immediately starting the following dialogue. Oliver: my friend Jacques, we both having the same tutor, says that of all the kings of France and England, the worst king ever was Henry VIII. Aye. Does he now? And what did you tell him? Oliver: I didn't know what to say, uncle. Is it true that we English have it the worst king of all between France and England together? Aye. No, my boy, 'tis not true. The worst king ever was the French king, Louis XIV. Oliver: but Jacques said that he was good. He acted for the glory of France and made France much bigger. Aye. Yes, but by doing so, he used up all the money the French people had and made the poor even poorer. He was a type of despot. Oliver: a despot? Aye. Yes, a king who does what he likes, even though it be bad for the nation, and who ignores the wishes of the people. Oliver: but then wouldn't that mean Henry VIII was a despot too, uncle? Jacques says that he killed over 50,000 Englishmen, his own countrymen, executing them without cause. Aye. Yes, 'tis again true, but if we look at Louis XIV, by starting the many wars he killed either directly or indirectly perhaps 2 million Frenchmen as a result. Or so my friend Diderot said, bless his soul. Do you know how many times 50,000 goes into 2 million? Oliver: yes, I believe that it goes 40 times, is 40 times more. Aye. Well done, you've already mastered your division. You tell Jacques straight away next time about the 2 million against 50,000. 'Tis clear who was worst. Oliver smiled at that. I'm interested to see how he shall respond. Aye. I am too. You must tell me about it next time. And with that, we arose and went to dinner. Now if we turn to the subject of tyrants and despots, autocrats and potentates, Caesars and autarchs, in your own 20th and 21st century throughout the Anglosphere and on the continent as well, we find today the book of political commentator and limited government conservative Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast and editor-in-chief at the Dispatch Media Company. He and his colleagues representing usually broadly classically liberal perspectives on both the past and present. In Liberal Fascism, published in 2007, Goldberg attempts to rewrite much of the historiography of fascism by arguing that it really is a phenomenon of the left, not the right. Who would have guessed? Now, you would think that if you're writing a book on fascism, you would immediately at least try to define what it is you're writing about, but Jonah refuses to do that. How does he justify playing it deuces wild? He says, not even the professionals have figured out what exactly fascism is. It's an academic version of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The more closely you study the subject, the less clearly defined it becomes. And so he begs off doing his scholarly duty. So let's not be like Jonah, and let's take the risk by being explicit of being wrong about what it is we're talking about. Fascism is a species, a type of nationalism. And so what is nationalism? The belief that you can further the interests of your nation by violating property rights. But fascism is different from other, milder types of nationalisms because it believes in violating property rights more to a great degree. It's very violent. Thus, the Nazis killed tens of millions. Mussolini invading Ethiopia, Libya, and Greece killed perhaps over 500,000. The Iron Guard in Romania, over 1,000 in 5 months, murdered. The Arrow Cross in Hungary
10,000 to 100,000, and finally, if we include Japan as a fascist state, tens of millions dead. So fascism is very violent nationalism. So given that we've now done Jonah's job for him and have a working definition, let's turn to examine actual alleged examples of liberal fascism he provides. Example number 1, Mussolini. In order to prove that Mussolini was really on the left, a liberal fascist, Jonah points out that A, Mussolini and Lenin were mutual admirers. B, Mussolini's fluency in socialist theory was certainly impressive to anyone who knew him. C, Mussolini in 1914 said, "Socialism is in my blood," and D, that the Fascist Party in 1919 gave out a manifesto with a whole list of partly socialist political demands called the Manifesto of the Italian Fasces of Combat. Let's stop to examine these 4 points. Imagine that when you went to college, you wanted to do one thing. But then, after completing half your degree, you realized you'd rather do something else. But Jonah would say, see, you previously wanted to be X, so you're not Y, even though you get paid for doing Y every day. Similarly, Mussolini was a socialist, and then from 1919 to 22 transitioned to being a nationalist, which is why the Fascist Party and movement in Italy gave up what socialist demands it had previously expressed in its aforementioned manifesto, and was utterly nationalist, 95+% from 1922 onwards. The fascists, by this time, hated socialists, just like the Nazis did, and killed them by the thousands in the streets. They murdered the socialist politician, Giacomo Matteotti, which could have derailed Mussolini's career. But you won't find Jonah mentioning that. Let's continue. He says E, as more alleged proof on the need for a revolutionary elite to impose its will upon the masses, Mussolini and Lenin held almost identical views. Sure, because they were both totalitarians believing in revolution. F, he says, the Italian fascists held pageants and performed elaborate pagan rites in order to convince the masses and the world that fascism is a religion. No, what they actually had was a secular ideology, not a religion, since they didn't believe in the supernatural. Did they think Mussolini was a god? Having disposed of Mussolini, let's next turn, as Jonah does, to Hitler and the Nazis. Example number 2. Not surprisingly, Jonah simply name-drops political philosophers Eugene Weber, A. James Gregor, and George Moss, who agree with him that Hitler's Germany was not fascist. He claims that many leading scholars agree with him. But the reality? Only about 5 to 10% do. This is close to the lizard man constant. So, how does he try to argue that the Nazis weren't fascist, directly contrary to 90+% of scholars? A, he says what Hitler got from the Italian fascism was the importance of having an idea that would arouse the masses. Well, that's right. Hitler understood that A, racism, the idea of Aryan superiority and Jewish and Slavish inferiority, moved the masses, and B, that the idea of aggressive German nationalism moved the masses as it had for the last half century in German history. B, next he claims the 4 significant ideas we can be sure Hitler treasured in their own right were power concentrated in himself, hatred and fear of Jews, faith in the racial superiority of the German folk, and ultimately war. Exactly. A, he didn't believe in democracy, but his own revolutionary will to power, which is another attribute of fascists. B, he took racist pride in his Germany's racial heritage and against other non-traditional Germans like Jews. And C, he believed in the violence of war to make Germany bigger. He was obviously a violent, racist nationalist, a fascist. C, Jonah actually admits that once in power, the Nazis established state capitalism as a reward to the industrialists. Exactly. Where's the socialism in that, Mr. Goldberg? D, he claims Hitler deserves to be placed firmly on the left because first and foremost, he was a revolutionary. No, all totalitarians, whether they're on the right or left, are revolutionaries. So on the revolutionary right as well as Hitler, Mussolini and the fascists, the Romanian Iron Guard, and the Hungarian Arrow Cross, all revolutionaries, but all fascist. E, he says Nazism, like the New Left in America, emphasized health, food, and exercise. Yes, they emphasized health food and exercise because they wanted the folk, the German people, to be healthy so they could fight effectively in the coming war. Very nationalistic. Not like the average person today who buys at Whole Foods like Jonah admits he himself does. This is also why many German gymnastic societies were nationalist. F. Remember how Jonah earlier quoted Mussolini in the Fascist Party Manifesto of 1919, which contained a number of socialistic policy proposals which were later largely abandoned? Well, Jonah utilized the exact same technique here with Hitler and the Nazis. He quotes their 1920 25-point program 13 years before they came to power, even though later on the Nazis abandoned many of the socialistic points. They, number one, banned trade unions and profit sharing with them. Number two, they only communalized Jewish department stores, not Aryan. Number three, with loan sharks and those charging high interest, they only got after the Jews, not the Aryans. 4, they did not confiscate the war profits of German companies. And 5, they did not nationalize trusts and most private companies. So again, they gave up many of their present socialist demands. G. He says that a monumental fact of the Nazi rise to power has been slowly airbrushed from our collective memories, is that the Nazis campaigned as socialists. Well, although they sometimes use socialist rhetoric in a populistic way, this is not true in the economic sense. They campaigned as anti-Marxist, and once they were in power, they became massive crony capitalists. And of course, in 1934, Hitler purged the whole Nazi left wing, the NSDAP, in the Night of the Long Knives. That you won't hear from Jonah. In Russia, the owners of factories were dispossessed, then killed or sent to the Gulag. But in Germany, the owners of companies like IG Farben, Krupp, Volkswagen, BMW, Siemens, Daimler-Benz, and many others raked in huge amounts of profits. That's crony capitalism, not socialism. And so there we have at length his argument for why the Nazis were allegedly a party of the left. Let's turn now to example number 3, Woodrow Wilson. First, Jonah claims that Woodrow Wilson during World War I was the actual head of a fascistic dictatorship. He was an intentional totalitarian. So if Hitler and Mussolini themselves killed millions of people, Woodrow Wilson would have had to have been responsible for killing at least many thousands as well. But how many people did Woodrow murder? 0. Secondly, he says more dissidents were arrested or jailed in a few years under Wilson than under Mussolini during the entire 1920s. Yes, but A, those convictions partly occurred again during wartime, when presidents legitimately have more power. B, Hitler and Mussolini imprisoned together hundreds of thousands, not 2,000 like Wilson. C, Wilson certainly believed in democracy and stepped down from power, while Mussolini, on the other hand, held only sham elections after 1919, and Hitler only sham elections after 1933. D, Wilson, of course, was an internationalist who helped set up the League of Nations, the opposite of Hitler and Mussolini. And finally, E, Wilson was not an economic socialist, calling the Russian communists tyrants and barbarians. So no, Woodrow Wilson's presidency was not that of a fascist, but instead a primarily wartime authoritarian. Next, example number 4, FDR. He says, A, Franklin Roosevelt was no fascist, but many of his ideas and policies were indistinguishable from fascism. So Jonah's strategy is to claim the ideas were fascist, but not the person. B, in terms of the actual policies of FDR, which Jonah claims are fascist, number 1, Social Security. Number 2, a Soak the Rich Bill, the 1935 Revenue Act. Number 3, populist appeals to resentment against fat cats, international bankers, economic royalists, and so on. Number 4, FDR's internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Number 5, the Civilian Conservation Corps, established during the Depression to employ millions of young men in improving public parks and reserves. And number 6, the NRA, the National Recovery Act. Let's take these claims one by one. Number 1, Social Security. Does this American nationalized pension program feel like fascism to present-day Americans? or instead like just another incompetent, enormously in the red government program. Number 2, the Soak the Rich Bill. It contained a 79% top tax rate, but the Nazis had lower tax rates, and although they did sometimes attack the rich before coming to power in 1933 and afterwards, this stopped because they weren't actually socialists. Number 3, the internment of Japanese Americans, imprisoning 120,000 for 4 years. But in the Nazi Reich, probably over 10 million Jews, Russian POWs, and others were killed. Comparing these two as equal is an absurdity. Number 4, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, as opposed to its German equivalent, the RAD, the Reichsarbeitsdienst. This was voluntary, not compulsory, was not as militarily organized, did not involve indoctrination like the German, focused on environmental and not quasi-military tasks, and finally it only existed as a standalone program, unlike the German, which was integrated with many other mandatory programs for different age groups. Number 5, the NRA. Yes, it had similarities in constructing industry cartels, but there were differences as well. A, the NRA supported labor unions, while the Nazis and fascists outlawed them. B, the NRA was understood to be temporary until the economy recovered, not to increase armaments and prepare for war. So again, the NRA was done for different reasons. The American were mildly socialistic, the German and Italian were fascistic. Example number 5, the 1960s. Jonah claims that the 60s were the dawn of the third fascist moment in American life. Examples given? A, he mentions many violent radical groups like the Black Panthers, the Weathermen, and SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and claims that their propensity to violence illustrates their fascism, quoting the leader of the SDS, Tom Hayden, who said, "I say a case can be made for violence in the peace movement." But of course, Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Pol Pot, and Ho Chi Minh, too, were violent. Were they fascists? No, they were commies on the left, like these groups. B, he claims that the parallel between the reformation of American universities in the 1960s and what occurred in Nazi Germany runs even deeper, citing the popularity of the Nazi philosopher Martin Heidegger among some 60s radicals. But again, the tenured radicals who came to colonize American higher education during and after the 60s were mainly left liberals, socialists, communists, woke theorists, postmodernists, hardcore feminists, and radical environmentalists, the vast majority of whom aren't nationalists, racists, since they fought racism, and C, against democracy. D, he claims the Maos and Castros and Che Guevaras were all nationalists committed to National Socialism, promising to enact a truer and more organic democracy. True? Mao, although he invaded Tibet, in part was a patriot who wanted to save his country from the foreign powers who had meddled with and in it for over a century. With Castro, he generally was not an imperialist, so not a nationalist in the sense of Mussolini or Hitler. Similarly, Che, as bad as he was an anti-imperialist, an internationalist, and Marxist revolutionary. So these three were communist revolutionaries, not racist, nationalist, crony capitalists who transformed their economies to build up their war machine to conquer other countries. Example number 6, eugenics. A, what Jonah doesn't point out is that the German eugenics program was radically more violent once the Nazis came into power in 1933. It changed from sterilization to actual murder. Compared to the total American sterilization count of 60,000, the Nazis sterilized 400,000 and then also murdered 250,000, some of these able-bodied gypsies, blacks, or those diagnosed as asocial. And that's why we call Nazism fascism and the American sterilization program not the same in terms of its violence. So there we have it. Jonah's 6 attempts to prove that fascism is actually liberal, not conservative. I would say he's 10% right, since you can find bits and pieces of socialist legislation and rhetoric among the German and Italian fascists, and to a degree among the progressives, but overall, he's 90% wrong. Let's briefly review again why he falls flat on his face over and over and over again. Number 1, Bismarck. He claims Bismarck, who instituted state welfare, was a top-down socialist, which is completely false. Bismarck was a reactionary conservative who fought the socialists his whole political life, who outlawed them as a party for almost 12 years, and who instituted these welfare reforms for reactionary, not liberal, reasons. Number 2, Mussolini. Jonah heroically tries, by focusing on Mussolini's past, to make him a socialist from the 1920s on. This fails miserably because A, he wasn't a socialist from the 20s on, becoming a nationalist and even initially privatizing the Italian economy, and B, because his fascist party was filled overwhelmingly with violent nationalists who murdered socialists. Number 3, the Nazis. Jonah again valiantly tries to put the Nazis on the left, but despite putting the name socialist in their party's title for pragmatic, populist reasons, once in power, Hitler ran a crony capitalist, racist command economy geared completely toward war imperialism. Number 4, Woodrow Wilson. Again, remember our definition. Wilson or his administration did not have the intensity, the degree of rights violations to be a fascist. In addition, he was democratic and didn't believe in annexing other countries. Number 5, FDR. Here again, Jonah goes badly wrong by A, ignoring the relative lack of intensity of FDR's rights violations, and the fact that FDR, like Hitler, A, believed in elections and democracy, B, he didn't believe in the violent annexation of other countries, and C, wasn't racist. 6, the 60s. Yes, the 60s had violent groups, but these came overwhelmingly from the Marxist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist left, not the right. Finally, number 7, regarding eugenics. Jonah gets a bit right here, but he largely fails even here for the following reasons. A, those who believed in eugenics were bipartisan. B, the intensity of the rights violations of the eugenicists was not like Italian and German fascists. And C, the eugenicists, progressives, in many instances, whatever they were conservative and Republican, not liberal. Let's finally bring this to a close. In conclusion, despite Jonah writing very engagingly here, as he always does, this is a pathetic argument. I would give it a D+. Jonah never has the simple wisdom to propose an accurate working definition of fascism. If he had, motivated as he is to stick it to the libs, as he expressly says, he never would have written this highly misleading book. I would suggest instead Stanley Payne's brilliant A History of Fascism, 1914 to 1945. Happy for my part that Louis XIV was more of a fascist than Henry VIII. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.